Hello, I'm going to be talking today about Chapter 2 of The Great Gatsby. I spoke in my lecture video about how Fitzgerald utilizes color in Chapter 1, and white is the color of wealth and an ease of life. In this chapter, a chapter that's going to talk about the geographical region of the Valley of Ashes, he's going to utilize gray. And gray is going to represent the working class, the laborers, and to a certain extent too, this lifelessness that exists, that there is a sort of desolation. He calls it a dumping ground. But this is where he's also making his class distinction, where you have people who are laborers working, but don't have a lot to show for their life. This is also the opportunity for Nick to not only find out how Tom got his girlfriend, who she is, but also to meet her. So we also discussed yesterday this whole idea of how Fitzgerald sets up the geography. You have these two areas of land, the East Egg and the West Egg, and this body of water in between, but to the south you have land that connects. So as you move from East Egg, where Tom is, he's going to come over and pick up Nick in the West Egg, and they're going to be working their way toward Manhattan so they can hang out together. And because the train has to stop occasionally, sometimes for up to 30 minutes, in order for water traffic to get through on the river that is crossed by that bridge that's going to go over to Manhattan, that's why they were stopped and able to get out of the Valley of Ashes, which is where Tom's girlfriend, as we find out, Myrtle, lives. We also find out that Myrtle is living with her husband, so she is married as well and cheating on her husband, and her husband is an auto mechanic. So it's something that I want you to pay attention to, is to observe when Tom comes into the shop so that he can see Myrtle, the class distinction that is made and the power difference between the two characters of Tom Buchanan and George Wilson. I'm going to read just a little bit from where it's describing the interior of the auto repair shop. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford which crouched in a dim corner. It had occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself appeared in the door of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. Now, if you just went through that particular paragraph and looked at the adjectives, dust, waste, anemic, the fact that even George's eyes are lacking much color, much pigmentation in there, all indicates, as Fitzgerald wants us to associate, this lifelessness. And so Tom is somebody who's very powerful compared to someone like George. And that helps us to understand too, not that it justifies it, but why Myrtle would be so attracted to someone like Tom Buchanan. Not only is he someone who exceeds her social status greatly, has a lot of money, he's someone who personality-wise too even has a lot more power just in his personality and the way he presents himself. The other thing too is we can sort of understand the contrast as Nick is observing Myrtle. Even though Myrtle is not described as being very beautiful, she has a certain vitality that is contradictory to the environment in which she lives. And if you compare her to the ladylike, demure, always raised in good money, Daisy, Myrtle strikes quite the contrast, and I think it's no coincidence that both the names Daisy and Myrtle represent flowers. So that's just something for you to keep in mind, that you've got those comparisons there. Now, in terms of breaking those social classes and the affair that exists between the two people, I do want to remind you though that among all the people who are involved, the only person who rules don't really apply to is Tom. Tom is somebody who is allowed to break the rules. He can do pretty much whatever he wants. And because there are no consequences to his actions, there's this perpetuation of that cycle of entitlement that was laid out for us in chapter 1. Of course, Tom and Myrtle decide that they're going to meet together, and Nick, although he tries to put up a fight and say he can't go with them, he does end up going and meeting up with Myrtle later so that they can go to this apartment in Manhattan, which is what houses Tom's affairs. It's not Myrtle's apartment. This is something that's being paid for by Tom. So we might also be able to discern this is not the first time that he's had this kind of a plan, or maybe she is not the first woman he's brought to this particular place. Kids always ask me every year about the dog, and I want to take a few minutes to talk about that. When this particular crew is on their way to the apartment in Manhattan, they stop and they buy a dog. And even though the dog is not going to really show up, the dog will appear in one more chapter just as a footnote there. But I want you to think as a reader, when you buy a puppy, how much care do you have to give it every day? How often does it need to be fed? How often does it need to be let out? And how much love do you need to give a puppy every day? Well, then you need to think about the question of who actually lives in the place where the dog is going to live, because no one lives there full time, and the dog is not going to go home with Myrtle. It's not going to, there's no explanation for that. And Tom is not somebody who is going to raise his lover's dog in his house with his real family. So this scene really sort of represents and allows Fitzgerald to communicate this need for immediate gratification. These are people, Tom at least, are people who are not accustomed to having to wait for whatever they want. They don't have to think about the consequences for their actions. They just do what pleases them in the moment. The poor decisions continue throughout the rest of the afternoon and evening. There's going to be a party where they invite the neighbors from below, and also Myrtle's sister Catherine shows up. And Catherine is going to be important to come in, not only as somebody who also is going to be somebody who sort of has no real consequences. She talks about a trip that she took to Monte Carlo and how she didn't really understand how she lost all of her money, and you know, she feels like she got cheated out of that. But her real importance as a character comes with her conversation with Nick, where she indicates that Tom and Myrtle are in love with each other, and if it weren't for Daisy, they would be together. And she says it's because Daisy is Catholic and can't get a divorce. Well, Nick has a unique position of knowing that is not true, and here rumors are such a crucial part of the plot as well. It's not true that she's a Catholic, but it doesn't matter because this is the truth that these people are living by. One of the things too that happens in chapter 2 is Myrtle has felt more and more emboldened to do as she pleases. Her character sort of changes and becomes more haughty as the chapter goes on. She changes her costume. She says things like "these people" when she's talking about the help. And of course, those are people from among her own social status, but here she's sort of living in a fantasy world. And this is where her being a little bit too comfortable and emboldened in her relationship with Tom is going to come to a screeching halt. And so, of course, they get into a fight, which is no doubt perpetuated by the fact that they've been drinking all day. And yes, this is in a time with prohibition, but again, no consequences, nobody really cares. And so proportional to how much they've had to drink is sort of how aggressive they get. And this argument, of course, concludes with Tom being incredibly violent physically toward Myrtle. And he doesn't care that he's done it in front of all these people. There are no apologies. And that asserts that power dynamic both in terms of gender and also within class. Because he doesn't have to answer to Myrtle, and he doesn't have to justify his actions to anyone else in the room. The last thing I want to talk about regarding this chapter is I love how Fitzgerald uses perspectives and pictures and drinking in this chapter. There's a lot of talk about how Mr. McKee, the neighbor downstairs, is a photographer, but his pictures are often out of focus and play tricks on the eye. You're not quite sure when you're looking at what it is that you're looking at when you're looking at one of his pictures. And likewise, as the characters continue to drink throughout the day, Nick becomes less and less reliable as a narrator because he misses pieces of the story or he's distracted. And so that's also one of the reasons why it was important for Nick to point out to us that he doesn't drink. This is so rare that, in fact, this is only the second time that it's ever happened in his life. This drinking is also the reason why the end of the chapter is so discombobulated and confusing. He ends up going back to Mr. McKee's apartment and looking at his photograph portfolio, and at the very end of the chapter, that's what those their titles at the end of what he's looking at, Brooklyn Bridge and so forth. And then it skips to, we don't know how he got out of Mr. McKee's apartment, and it's 4 a.m. and or at least it's a little bit before 4 a.m. and he's waiting in Penn Station for the train to take him home. So chapter 2 is very good at revealing the fact that a lot of characters are in here making poor choices, and we're probably a little bit wise as readers knowing that something's going to get caught up with something else here pretty soon. So I hope you are enjoying these lessons and that you're enjoying the novel, which is one of my very, very favorites. And I'll check back in with you with chapter 3. Take care.